Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really cool question. Is cultural resistance even possible? Can a culture, which is supposed to be about shared values, also be a place for rebellion? Let's get into it.
So let's start with a puzzle. You see a youth subculture, like punk, goth, you name it. What are you really looking at? Is it just a fashion statement? A phase they're going to grow out of? Or is there something way deeper going on, a real act of defiance?
To figure this out, we're going to head back in time to post-war Britain. It turns out this era was an absolute hotbed for youth subcultures, and it gives us the perfect case study for how things like style, music, and just plain attitude can become really powerful tools of resistance.
So let's take the mods, for example. They just exploded onto the London scene back in the late 1950s. And these weren't just kids wearing nice suits, not by a long shot. Their entire style was carefully, meticulously put together, from the sharp Italian scooters right down to the perfect haircut. They were even called a kind of lower-class dandy, using fashion to build a whole new identity for themselves.
And here's the crucial point, right? This whole boutique lifestyle was a very conscious rejection of two different things at the same time. On one hand, they were pushing back against the conventional, often tough life of their working-class parents. And on the other, they were rejecting the stuffy, mainstream culture of the establishment. They were literally creating their own world, their own path through the power of style.
But what's really driving all this rebellion? What's the engine behind it? Well, to get that, we need to unpack a pretty big philosophical idea, one that explains why this kind of conflict isn't just a random thing, but something that's basically inevitable.
And that big idea is contradiction. Thinkers like Hegel and Marx argue that this is the force that drives all change in the world. Think about it. You can't have up without down, right? Or light without dark. These opposites totally depend on each other for their meaning. And it's the tension between them that creates movement and change. And in society, that tension is always there between different groups and cultures.
And look, this isn't just some abstract idea stuck in a philosophy book. It's considered a universal law. Philosophers pretty much agreed. Contradiction is everywhere, it's in everything, and it's the very thing that pushes the world forward.
You can see this principle of opposing forces playing out everywhere you look. In math, you've got your plus and minus. In mechanics, action and reaction. In physics, positive and negative electricity. And, most importantly for us, in social science, you have the class struggle. Each side is locked in this constant dance with its opposite.
Okay, so let's take this huge idea of contradiction and bring it right back to the world of culture, where the battles aren't fought with armies, but with ideas, with styles, and with tastes.
What's really fascinating is you can see a perfect contradiction within the field of cultural studies itself, with the clash between these two big schools of thought. On one side, you had the Frankfurt School. They were pretty elitist, and they saw popular culture as this cheap tool of capitalism that was basically ruining high art. But then, the Birmingham School came along and saw it in a completely different light. For them, popular culture was the actual battlefield where working-class youth fought back.
And this quote just nails it. The tension between the dominant culture and the people who feel left out by it, that's the whole key. It shows us that wherever you find a dominant power structure, some form of resistance is basically built into the system. It has to happen. It's the natural result of that power dynamic.
So, now that we have this new tool, this new lens of contradiction, we can look back at those post-war youth subcultures with totally fresh eyes. They're not just random fads anymore, are they? No, they are living, breathing examples of this universal principle in action. Let's start with one of the earliest groups from the 1950s, the Juke-box boys. Now, these working-class kids didn't have some flashy uniform. The rebellion was actually way more subtle. They'd hang out in these cheap milk bars, pumping coins into jukeboxes to blast American rock and roll. And in doing that, they were really doing two things at once. They were rejecting the refined high culture of the elites, and at the same time, they were plugging into this new global culture that was starting to blur those old, rigid class lines.
But right on their heels came another group, one with a much more confrontational and in-your-face style. Yeah, let's talk about the Teddy Boys.
The Teddy Boys were absolutely impossible to ignore. The pointy shoes, the specific outfits, it was a direct challenge to the way things were. The media, of course, painted them as a total menace, a sign of society falling apart. But their style was a really powerful statement against both the working-class culture they came from and the elite culture that looked down on them. Okay, so this paints a pretty clear picture of rebellion, doesn't it? But it makes you ask a really important question. For this whole dance of opposites to work, both sides have to have some strength.
So what happens when one side of that contradiction, well, what if it just falters? What happens when a resistance movement just doesn't get off the ground? Well, take this Shamate in China, back around 2008. These were young migrants from rural areas who tried to create this new identity using this wild mix of visual styles. But they were kind of stuck in the middle. They didn't really belong in their rural homes anymore, but they weren't fully accepted in the big cities either. So without a strong unified community, their resistance never really took hold, and the whole movement just fizzled out. All right, so after exploring all these examples, the ones that worked and the ones that didn't, let's bring it all the way back to the question we started with. Is cultural resistance really an oxymoron? And the answer we're left with is a clear, resounding no. Cultural resistance isn't a contradiction at all. In fact, it's the natural, totally inevitable result of all the power dynamics and class tensions that are just baked into the fabric of society.
So here's how the logic breaks down. First, society itself is full of these opposing forces. That's the contradiction. Second, one group usually holds the power, what you might call hegemony. Third, the group that's not in power naturally pushes back, using style and rituals as their tools of resistance. And finally, that back and forth, that constant push and pull, is what actually drives cultural change. It's what keeps everything moving.
And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. If this engine of contradiction is always running, if resistance is always being born from domination, what does that look like right now, today? What are the main cultural forces in our time, and where and how are people pushing back against them? What are the contradictions that are defining the culture you're living in?